This tutorial is about opposition to the New Deal. You might wonder, first of all, why anybody would oppose Roosevelt's New Deal, looking at the situation in America in 1933 when Roosevelt started his job. But actually, when you take a closer look, there are some factors which led to that opposition. The first one is that actually the unemployment rate didn't actually substantially drop anywhere below 8 million. So there was still, throughout the 1930s, there was still a big problem with unemployment. And that was really the root cause of all opposition. People didn't think there was enough progress being made. The first group, which I suppose is going to be pretty obvious, that opposed the New Deal, would be Republican politicians, and there was large groups of Republican politicians who didn't agree. First of all, with the actual alphabet agencies and the things that Roosevelt were doing, but it was a wider political disagreement that the Republicans had with Roosevelt as a Democrat, and that all went back to this idea of what Roosevelt was actually doing was he was interfering in people's lives. His alphabet agencies seemed to involve themselves in every aspect of people's lives, whether it be their jobs, whether it be their home life. It was also this idea of giving aid to people. The Republicans would call that giving handouts. This kind of handout culture that they didn't like. The idea the government was just giving out was a charity. The Republicans didn't agree with that. They believe that the government should be laissez-faire. They believe that the government should stay out of ordinary people's lives and allow them to work out their own problems. And they thought that this was the foundation of America, really the cornerstone of America, and how it became such a great nation. So for them to see the New Deal really doing the opposite of what they believed, a lot of them spoke out against it. In saying that, they didn't do particularly well against Roosevelt in elections, but we'll come on to that later. Another form of opposition came from actually the Supreme Court of the United States, which was the highest court in America, the highest court of judgment in America. The Supreme Court actually announced that 11 out of the 16 alphabet agencies that existed in 1935 were illegal. So 11 out of 16 alphabet agencies were labelled as illegal. They actually said they were unconstitutional. The reason they gave was they said that actually there was a federal government which operated out of Washington. So I'll just go over here for that. You had your federal government operating out of Washington. And my analogy for this would be your kind of umbrella. Right, so you've got your federal government at the top, and your federal government looks after the 50 states in the USA. The federal government, for example, controls things like whether America would go to war or not. But individual states, and there's 50 of them, should have their own say over things like the postal service, things like the death penalty. So the individual states, by law, have their own governor, can create their own laws. Now, the Supreme Court had a problem with this because they were saying that Roosevelt's alphabet agencies told states what to do and enforce laws upon individual states, making them all do the same thing. And they actually accused Roosevelt of being a dictator, essentially, in the kind of Hitler mold, saying, he's overriding the Constitution and he's undermining the Constitution by doing these things. They weren't very happy about it, and for that reason they made 11 out of the 16 illegal. So to give you an example of some of those that he named illegal, you'll notice them from a previous tuition video I've done. The treble A was declared illegal and was consequently stopped. The NRA was labelled illegal and was consequently stopped. and several, and obviously there were 11. You can look them up yourself and see what they were, but there was real opposition there. Now Roosevelt argued the Supreme Court was made up of Republicans who hated him anyway, hated his guts anyway. But actually, they did have a point here. He was going against the U.S. Constitution. Roosevelt would argue he was doing everything he possibly could, and also it was a desperate situation, and desperate situations call for desperate measures. But there was definite opposition there from the Supreme Court. You also had individuals who opposed the New Deal for varying different reasons, and the most famous one of those was Huey Long. Huey Long didn't believe the New Deal was doing enough to help the poor, and his main argument actually went back to Roosevelt himself. It all went back to Roosevelt himself, who was actually brought up in quite a well-to-do family. He had quite a wealthy family background, and Huey Long was saying, well, it's all well and good, all these alphabet agencies, but they're not doing enough to actually help the poorest members of society. And he came up with this program called Share Our Wealth. Share Our Wealth, which would essentially put major taxes, massive taxes on the rich, and particularly the super rich. And that was his main way of creating this wealth. I'm sure Roosevelt's opposite argument would be that by overtaxing the rich, they can't spend their money and they can't actually fire up the economy. And it's basic economics. It's a real clash of economic ideas. But Huey Long is saying basically take that money off the rich to fund the poor. It's kind of a Robin Hood situation. And he actually got a lot of support, but that was stifled in 1935 when Huey Long was shot and killed, in fact, by one of his own bodyguards by accident. He fired a bullet trying to protect him, and it ricocheted off a wall and hit Huey Long and killed him. So it wasn't exactly the nicest of deaths for Huey Long. But he was just one individual who opposed the New Deal. There were others, like Father Charles Coughlin. Father Charles Coughlin went on the radio. He was a Catholic priest. He went on the radio and he had his own show, and he had 35 million listeners to his show every Sunday night. And on these shows, he would openly criticize Roosevelt. Again, he was saying he wasn't doing enough for poor people. Again, he was saying that the New Deal was some kind of con job. But mixed in there was also a lot of anti-Jewish sentiment. And he became quite anti-Semitic. He was blaming Jewish people for a lot of the problems that were happening in America. And therefore, he did lose a lot of his popularity. But his message was actually, again, very, very popular. This idea of Roosevelt not doing enough, which is hard to believe when you consider all the alphabet agencies and things that he actually set up. You've also got Townsend, Francis Townsend, who I'll just write down here. Francis Townsend was someone who believed that the way to cure the problems of the Depression was by increasing pensions for old people. That was his alternative to the New Deal. He thought that by increasing pensions, old people would actually spend that money on things, and that would actually bring about an economic recovery quicker than by giving freebies out to unemployed people. So his main idea was to increase the pension provision. Again, controversial. Are pensioners the ones who need that money the most? Is it the unemployed? Well, you can debate it long and hard, can't you? But that was Townsend's idea, and again, he received support for that, and some notable support for his kind of theories. So you had Republican politicians, the Supreme Court, individuals, and finally, just over here, you also have business people who actually didn't like the New Deal much either. Not all of them disliked the New Deal, but some of them particularly had a problem with the NRA, because if you remember, the NRA set minimum wages for employees. So you can imagine businesses who are already struggling are now having to pay minimum wage to their workers. So a lot of business people were saying, stop interfering on what we're trying to do. Stop getting involved. Stop setting up alphabet agencies that restrict us, that set new rules and codes that we have to follow. Roosevelt's answer to that was, I'm trying to help. I'm trying to introduce a fairer system that's actually going to help us in the long term. And if workers have more money, they'll spend more money. But as a business leader, or as business leaders as a collective, it proved a little bit unpopular with them. Despite all of this that is on there now, Roosevelt was very successful in the 1936 election. So this was the second election, his next election since he became president. And he won that election by a landslide. Massive victory. In saying all that, the Republicans actually got 16 million votes, or there were 16 million people who voted against Roosevelt. So that's quite a hefty number. But in terms of states won, it was still a massive victory for him. And some people would say, well, if opposition to the first New Deal was so bad, then why didn't that show up in the election? There was a lot of people who still felt really that Roosevelt was doing his best for the nation, and they wanted to give him another chance to do that, despite everything that is on your screen right now.